Ezekiel are like stupendous works of literature, probably above and beyond about most works of literature you'll find in most cultural expression. And I think for that reason, maybe their culture, the civilization represented, is justly well known. In any case, 1840 was a turning point in his life. This is a really important year. This is on page 103. There was actually a blood libel made in Damascus, and it swept the Jewish world because communications were strong enough at that time. I guess the telegraph was already operating. That people would have heard of it. Normally, back in the Middle Ages, you wouldn't have heard of it. Blood libel is, a accusation that the Jews are slaughtering a non-Jewish child in order to bake matzahs. It's so ridiculous that it's beyond comprehension. But this was going on in the Middle Ages all the time. Whenever that a non-Jewish Christian child or whatever, here it's a Muslim, would be seen near the Jewish ghetto, that maybe some rapist had dropped him off there, or some child molester or predator or whatever, then if it was around Easter or Passover time or something, then the superstitious crowd would be worked up into this was the Jews were making their holy bread with Christian blood again, or other things with the desecration of the host, where the Jews were accused of sneaking into churches and sticking pins into the host because the doctrine of transubstantiation of Christ had just been introduced in those days, and Jesus' actual flesh, according to this papal doctrine. I don't know how many Protestant groups believe in this. Depends how close to Roman Catholicism or distant they become. But that the host was the actual body of Jesus. So if the Jews could sneak into the churches and stick pins into it, they could torture Jesus again in the minds of the crowd. That's called the desecration of the host libel. And why, you'd have to be pretty ignorant to think anyone was doing that. But in any case, the demonology is a very powerful thing. So this suddenly surfaced after people thought it had disappeared. And it had an effect on Moses Hess, apparently, to return to Judaism, as we'll see. And so he writes this in 1843, 3 years later. Again, just like Kalischer was writing a little later, but also he wrote earlier, Kalischer. His pleading is addressed to Jewish financiers, Jewish notables in the West. One in England, the most famous one, is Moses Montefiore. Again, that is a Sephardi name. The Jews in England were originally Sephardis, and others, to buy land from the Turks, just using biblical models as Abraham had done from the Hittites. And he also went to different European capitals to try to inspire this kind of practical work. And Herzl's grandfather had read Alkaline, and as he says here, he was one of his admirers and disciples. So Herzl doesn't appear in a vacuum. When your grandfather is interested in someone, often you ultimately find that of interest to you. So it's just that Herzl had more ability to be a practical person for highly educated in the secular European world. So he could function in the secular European world where these people were still fairly religious. And he says, pardon me, not Herzl, but one of Alkali's descendants says, I thought about my grandfather, he's called a rabbi or still, Yehuda I Alkali. Hai means to live, who spent his life preaching the return to the land, and I remembered my grandmother, his wife, who in joyous dedication had sold her jewels to enable my grandfather to publish his books, in which he broadcast his ideas about the return to the land of Israel. So you see, this is already stirring in the early 1800s, and of course this fright of the blood libel in Damascus in 1840, and you could look into that further if you're interested. Sure, you could Google it up and find it in Wikipedia or someplace. That's what everyone gets information from these days. I don't think you need to go to libraries anymore. It's all in the, pretty soon the whole library is going to be in the computer anyway, so we just chuck the building away, ultimately, I guess, you know. You know, that's why the libraries in people places don't want to reduce their stock to Google. Big struggle going on. Google wants to, you know, copy everything in these big libraries. And they want to charge Google because they're afraid that if Google does this, they'll go out of business, you know, which they will. And but anyway. The third redemption. So this is earlier because it's in this collection, because it's written earlier than Kalischer's work. But Kalischer had an earlier work at this time. And of course, the next one we're going to read is Rome and Jerusalem, which is a very substantial work by Moses Hess. And that's 1845. So a lot of this is going on, I think it's 1845, isn't it? Let's see. No, it's 1862. I'm wrong. I apologize. Okay, 1862. The year after Kalischer. He's basically following chronology here in the selections he gives in this book. It's written in the Bible, if you're interested in redemption, return the Lord and the tens and thousands of the families of Israel. Etc., etc. So yet we pray every day. Let our eyes behold thy return on mercy unto Zion. So this is the prayer for the return to Zion that the Reform are throwing out. She's asking me, how come Reform don't agree with these things? Are you kidding me? We just found out why the Reform don't agree with these things. They chucked it all out of the prayer books. Why did they chuck it out of the prayer books? That's the whole point of what we just studied. Because they wanted to look like they were good Germans, Frenchmen, Americans. They didn't want people to question their citizenship or their belonging to the new national entities they wanted to be part of. And anyone who was praying for return to Zion, we don't want to go back to Zion. When the First World War comes and Eisenman gets the Balfour Declaration from the British, which is addressed, of course, to Lord Rothschild, again, as a prominent, wealthy representative of the Jewish people. The anti-Zionists among the Jews in England protest. They don't want the Balfour Declaration. They don't want His Majesty's government to look with favor on the founding of a Jewish state in Palestine. They think that'll undermine their claim to British citizenship. The British will say, okay, well, you Jews out, go to Palestine. We don't want you here. So that's what they're worried about. Sure, I mean, there's a huge struggle going on here between the assimilationists and the others. But he's giving the prayer. See, we didn't have anyone actually. Here is the prayer.